Hello. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to read you a story. And it's a story that I wrote back in 2013. I wrote it for my niece Megan, who at the time was 7. And it's a children's story, but it's for adults also. And it's called The Prince Who Listened. There we go. See the prince there, I hope. And my friend James Innerdale did the illustrations. So sit back, relax and enjoy. So, The Prince Who Listened, a story of love, listening and being bold by Anne Algie. And this book is dedicated to young people and displaced persons everywhere. May we always listen to our hearts. Once upon a time, in a land called Albion, there lived a prince with rather large ears. People sometimes laughed at him and called him names. They called him Big Ears and Dumbo, after the elephant who could fly using his enormous ears. But in fact, this prince was very, very clever. He certainly wasn't a Dumbo. He knew lots of things that other people didn't know. The prince was a very kind and gentle man. He liked people and he loved nature. He liked plants and flowers and animals. Because he was a prince in a land that was very noisy and busy, it was sometimes very difficult for him. His rather large ears meant that he heard everything. He heard the thousands of cars rushing past his palace every day. He heard the aeroplanes, the helicopters, and the sirens of police cars as they hurried to the latest emergency. He heard the televisions, radios, computers, mobile phones and tablets as they constantly rang, beeped and buzzed. He heard the millions of people that lived in his country as they talked, complained or shouted. He heard the noise of the tills in the supermarkets beeping as the many items whizzed past the scanners. He heard the leaders in governments around the world talking and debating about how to make economies grow. He heard the bankers and investors discussing ways to make more money. All this noise made the prince sad. He looked at his people and he saw that they were unhappy too. They were so busy rushing and had so many noises around them that they had no time to think, or more importantly, to feel. The prince was starting to find it difficult to think too. He knew that he was very lucky because he had a big palace with lots of rooms where he could sit quietly if he wanted to. He had lovely gardens to stroll in and woods to ride his horse in. However, lately the noise of the machines seemed to be getting louder and louder, so that sometimes, even in his beautiful woods, he could hear fighter planes practicing for a distant war, or huge machines digging the earth. As I mentioned before, the prince was a clever man, and he knew things that other people did not know. This was because his ears helped him to listen to little noises as well as big ones. He needed to spend time in quieter places and with quieter people. Otherwise, the loud noises would begin to upset him or give him a headache. So he listened to streams flowing, leaves on the trees rustling in gentle breezes, butterflies fluttering, bees buzzing, snowflakes falling, cats purring, deer walking in the forest, and his own heart beating. He listened to the words and ideas of thoughtful people. He listened to babies laughing, toddlers playing, teenagers' bright ideas, and the reflections of wise old men and women from all around the world. He knew that everyone had something to offer, and that even though people lived in different countries, spoke different languages, believed in different religions, or had different coloured skin, they were all human beings who loved, laughed, and cried. He knew that people were part of nature, and so it made sense to look after the planet and all the plants and creatures on it. He knew that people were happier in natural surroundings. He knew that the loudest voices were not necessarily saying the most important things. He knew that having a lot of money and possessions did not always make people happy. Most importantly of all, he knew that the world was in big trouble and needed help. His eldest son had recently had a son of his own, and so the prince was now a grandfather. This made him very, very happy. He loved his grandson more than anything in the world. It also made him sadder than ever about the noisy world, and he knew he had to try to make things better for his grandson and for all the other young people. Therefore, one day he decided that he would ride out on his horse until he could find a place where only the sounds of nature could be heard. He wanted to sit quietly and think. He wanted to see if he could come up with a plan to help his people and the world. He rode deep into the forest until at last he came to a huge oak tree. Its leaves were a brilliant yellow and orange, and some were floating gently to the ground. His father had taken him on his first journey into the big forest and shown him this special place. He had explained about acorns growing into mighty oak trees, and how fantastic things can happen as a result of small actions. The prince had planted this tree 60 years earlier when he was just 5 years old. The oak tree stood next to a small stream. There was a large rock with a smooth flat surface between the tree and the stream. The prince tied his horse to the tree and sat on the rock, gazing at the clear water as it gently made its way around stones and obstacles. Sometimes leaves from the oak tree were carried along by the stream, and he followed their winding journeys until they disappeared out of sight. The prince sat and listened and hoped to find an answer. He didn't know what he hoped to hear. All he knew was that he loved this beautiful world. He loved his sons and grandson and cared deeply about his people who looked so unhappy. He listened to his own breathing as his chest rose up and down in long, calm, gentle sighs. He listened to the breathing of his horse, making a snorting sound as its warm breath mixed in steamy trails with the cool autumn air. He listened to the little stream gurgling over the rocks. He listened to a robin singing in the tree above his head and to the rustle of dry leaves as a blackbird hopped about looking for worms. He listened and waited for a good idea to come into his head. He felt the warm afternoon sun on his face, and slowly the prince began to realise that the answer to how he could help his people was in his heart, not his head. His heart could feel everything, just in the same way that his ears could hear everything. He decided that he would listen to his heart and then decide what to do. As he listened, he gathered acorns and put them in his pockets. After a short while, his pockets were so full that he had to empty them into his saddlebag. How amazing to have so many acorns from one tree, he thought. Slowly, as the sun began to get lower in the sky and the air began to get cooler, the prince thought of a plan to help his people. It was a plan of the heart, or a heart-shaped plan. He couldn't wait to get back to his palace to make a start. He rode his horse quickly, feeling alive and full of energy for the first time in a very long time. When he arrived at the palace, he went straight to his study, sat at his huge desk, and began to write down all the ideas that his heart had told him. He wrote for a long, long time, and then fell asleep with his head resting on his desk. In the morning, he telephoned all his very best friends and also many of the leaders of government, businesses, banks and newspapers, and invited them to come to the palace to attend a very special meeting. The next day, when everyone arrived at the palace, they were told that the prince was in his greenhouse. This was not a little greenhouse like the ones people sometimes have in their gardens, but a huge greenhouse full of plants from all around the world. The visitors walked into the greenhouse and saw the prince. He was wearing an old brown jumper and big green Wellington boots. His hands were covered in warm black compost. A pile of acorns was at his side, and he was taking one acorn at a time and putting it into a pot full of dark earth. After a few minutes, a man who was from the schools department spoke. "Your Royal Highness, why have you asked us all to come here to watch you planting acorns? We are very busy people and have much work to do. We can't stand around learning how to plant acorns." A couple of mobile phones rang, and one lady sent a text to her friend to say that she had just seen the prince wearing wellies and an old jumper. The prince paused and looked at all the people squashed into his greenhouse. Some were very good friends who looked at him with quiet concern. Others were people who worked in government, banks, charities, businesses and newspapers. Many of them looked impatient, confused, a bit irritated. The prince knew all about their busy, noisy lives. He had heard them many times telling him what he should do or what he should not do. Now he was going to show them what he was doing and invite them to join him in doing it. He knew it was risky, but he also knew it was a time to be bold. Because he was a prince, people usually followed his instructions, even if they thought he was silly. They wanted to feel important, and they liked to be able to tell their friends that they had visited the palace. The papers wanted to write stories about him. The businesses wanted to sell him things. The banks wanted to look after his money. The governments wanted to make sure he didn't say anything which would make it difficult for them to get re-elected. His friends loved him very much, but worried that his ideas would make him unpopular and that this would make him sad. Today, the prince felt bold. His heart had told him to help his people by doing what he loved doing most. Now, what the prince loved doing more than anything in the world was gardening, which was lucky because he had many big gardens to look after. He thought of his grandson, his sons, his people, and the beautiful planet, and he smiled, and then he laughed. Everyone went quiet. Some shuffled awkwardly from foot to foot and looked at each other with sideways glances. Then the prince began to speak. "Thank you for coming to see me in my greenhouse at such short notice. As you can see, I am a busy person too. I am busy planting acorns. I have called you here to let you know that from this day forward I will be working in my garden because this is the thing I love to do most in the world. If you want to speak to me, you will have to come and garden with me. I am now 65 years old, but when I was 5, my father took me riding in the woods and I planted my first acorn. Recently, I visited the oak tree that my acorn has now become and sat under its branches. I gathered these acorns from that same tree, and I am planting them today for you. I would be pleased if you would each accept one as a gift. You can either plant it or give it as a gift to someone else." Still the crowd was silent. "As you all know, I have extraordinary ears. I have heard you all talking over the years. I have heard your lives getting noisier and watched them getting faster. Your machines and gadgets set the pace and pull you this way and that. You look tired and unhappy as you queue up to spend money, sit for hours at your computers and drive slowly through the busy cities in your cars. You have no time to think or listen to your hearts. So today, I invite you to take a day off. Put your jackets, ties, phones, computers and bags on one side. You are welcome to join me in planting acorns if you wish, or you can choose to walk or sit in my beautiful gardens. I only ask one thing, and that is that you listen to your heart and see what it is telling you. I want my people and my grandchild to live in a world where they have time to smile and listen to one another, time to appreciate nature, time to help and support, to connect and to love. I would like it to be a fairer and more equal world, a quieter world, a world where people follow their hearts and do what they love." The people were silent, but now it was a different sort of silence. They all felt different things, but they were mostly surprised and shocked. The prince had said something which sounded as if it was very important, but they didn't feel they fully understood what he was saying. A man's phone rang and everyone looked at him. He worked in a big business in the city and was supposed to be at a meeting where he was to suggest a new factory be built on some allotments. His eyes were full of tears and he slowly took his phone from his pocket and switched it off. He then took his jacket off, rolled up his sleeves. Walking through the crowd to the pile of acorns, he picked up an acorn and began to fill a pot with earth. The prince smiled and said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, I must get on with the rest of my life." One by one, some of the people took off their jackets and tentatively began to plant acorns with the prince. Some kept their coats on and walked out into the crisp morning air, noticing the dew sparkling on the grass. One or two even noticed the tiny rainbows inside each dewdrop. Others decided not to stay because they were too busy and thought the prince was behaving very strangely. Those that stayed could smell the pine trees and earth. They kicked dry leaves and picked up beautiful red and orange ones, just as they had done when they were 5. Slowly they remembered. They breathed deeply and fought back tears. They struggled to understand what was happening and why they felt sad. It was their hearts starting to wake up. It was painful and beautiful at the same time. They knew something was not quite right with their noisy, busy lives. They often felt tired and unhappy, but they didn't have the time to work out what was wrong. It was easier to just continue. The people had a lovely day listening to their hearts and spending time surrounded by nature. They went home to their families, clutching their pots containing acorns, and told them all about their strange and unusual day. Of course, not everyone thought it was good, and some wrote not very nice stories in their newspapers, with titles like "Big Ears has a big idea" or "Dumbo is nuts about acorns." And one even wrote, "Prince goes potty in greenhouse." But many other people wrote nice things and began to think about what the prince had said, and word spread across Albion that the prince was now spending his time doing what he loved most, gardening. He held all his meetings with important leaders and businesses in the garden. He gave money to gardening projects. He helped to create many new gardens. He grew all his own fruit and vegetables. He wrote books on gardening, gave interviews on gardening, painted pictures of his garden, and he completely loved what he did. People all around the world talked about him. Some said nasty things, but some had always said nasty things. The prince took no notice because he knew that everyone has different ideas. Many people said good things, and slowly the people of Albion started to talk to each other and to listen to their prince. If the prince was saying that growing food, gardening and appreciating nature was good, then maybe it was. They began to plant apple trees, they grew tomatoes, they walked in the woods, they gathered blackberries, and most importantly, they planted acorns. Over the next 10 years, the prince had many brilliant ideas while he worked in his garden. He started a scheme where every child in the country planted an acorn on their first day at school. When the acorns had grown into little oak trees, they were then planted on the outskirts of the towns and villages to create woodland areas. He made it possible for all 13-year-old children to spend time at a woodland education centre, learning how to grow food and how to design and make things from natural materials. They also learned how to care for the earth, care for people, and to share things fairly. This was called permaculture. Older people were encouraged to join the Oak Club. This stood for Older Age Knowledge. The older people passed on their skills and knowledge to younger people and trained them to grow and preserve food and to make useful wooden objects. They also taught many other crafts like spinning, making clothes, making shoes, thatching, dry stone walling, dyeing and weaving, and even how to build lovely houses with straw and mud. Children were now able to leave school at 15 if they wanted and could attend one of the prince's centres for growing. They learned many useful skills and were paid to grow food for their local communities. The prince became very popular and respected by his people. Important people listened to his ideas and came up with good ideas of their own. Everyone enjoyed going to the meetings he held in his garden. They were surrounded by flowers and butterflies and could drink real lemonade and apple juice. It was much more fun than sitting around a big table in an office drinking bottled water. Slowly the world changed. The people slowed down. They laughed more. They spent more time outside, and they were healthier and happier. They became less fearful and more tolerant of different ideas and cultures. They began to see that the world of nature was abundant when people worked with it rather than against it, and that there was enough for everybody's needs. Machines were used less. Those that were used were designed more and more around nature, and they were much quieter. People spent more time growing food. Young people grew up knowing it was important to have quiet times in which to listen to what their hearts were telling them. The quiet prince continued to garden and even set aside some of his land to create allotments so that the poorest people in the country could grow their own food too. His son became a great leader of the people and had good ideas of his own. His grandson grew up in a world where it was okay to have big ears and a big heart. The prince lived happily ever after, knowing that his people were happy and the beautiful planet was happy too. From this time on, the people of Albion have called him the Prince with the Big Heart. The end. I've written a little note here at the end to young people, and I think it's worth reading that as well. I wanted to write a story for young people, as I believe that young people are the most precious thing we have in our society. You are our future. You will make the important decisions. You will take your turn in looking after the world, and you will also nurture the next generation. Therefore, any time we invest in you is, I believe, extremely worthwhile. However, because we care about you and are concerned for your future, I think we adults sometimes bombard you with messages about what you should or should not do. No one has the definitive answers as to how a life should be lived, and so it is important that you have the space and time to listen quietly to your own inner voice when deciding what to do with your precious life. The importance of feelings is frequently played down in our society, and so I wanted to write a story that redressed the balance between thinking and feeling. I based the story around nature because I think nature can teach us so much if we take the time to really look, listen and feel. Having written the book, I realised that this is very much a story for adults too, as many of us have forgotten what it feels like to be close to nature and rarely take the time to listen to our hearts. So I hope you enjoyed that little story, and I hope you get something out of it and find something useful in it that means something to you. For me, I think it's about when the world is difficult and there's bigger problems and we're not really sure which way to turn or what to do and how we do something useful in our lives, then I think by coming back to the things that we enjoy doing and doing what we love is a good thing. I don't think you can go far wrong if you just come back to doing what you love, whatever that is, and you will be putting some good things into the world by doing that. Okay, so lots of love, have a good week, and I'll see you next time. I should just say as well that if you've got any comments or anything on this video and anything you want to say about the book or anything, I'd really appreciate hearing about it. Good, bad, indifferent. It'd just be interesting for me, and I enjoy writing, so it would help my writing in the future as well. Bye.